For this explainer, we're starting with a pretty radical question. What if compliance, yeah, that thing everyone hates, wasn't a cost center, but was actually your most valuable asset? We're going to explore how to build something called institutional capital.
I mean, think about it. All that time your business sinks into documentation, audits, compliance, it feels like a chore, right? Something you do just to stay out of trouble. But what if all of that could be flipped on its head? What if it could be a proactive way to build some serious value? Well, that exact shift in thinking is changing the game.
So you've got these two totally different ways of looking at it. On one side, you have the old school reactive view. Compliance is just a burden, a necessary evil you have to pay for. But on the other side, there's what we're calling the capital view. Here, compliance is a strategic asset, a system you actively build to give yourself a real competitive edge. And that is the big idea we are unpacking today.
Okay, so let's dive right in and start by reframing this whole idea, looking at how we can turn documentation from a burden into a core asset.
The phrase you need to get familiar with is institutional capital. Now, this is not about cash in a bank account. It's about the hidden, intangible value that's locked up inside your company's systems, your documents, your audit trails, your version control. It's the verifiable proof of how you operate. And that proof, when you structure it the right way, becomes an incredibly powerful asset.
So, how do you actually build this? Well, it all comes down to creating what you could call an architecture of trust, where all that verifiable documentation makes your organization totally predictable.
And this slide is where you can really see the mindset shift. Traditionally, documentation is just a bunch of files you pull together for an audit. But in the capital view, it's a living, breathing, real-time data asset. Version control stops being about just having the latest manual. It becomes a perfect record of your decision-making. And here's the big one. Auditability goes from let's get ready for the review to being in a constant state of compliance by design. You're just always ready.
This quote right here, it gets to the very heart of the goal. When your operations are documented, when they're verifiable, you become reliable. And that predictability is the bedrock of trust. It massively lowers the verification cost for absolutely everyone you work with. Your partners, regulators, investors, they no longer have to waste their time and money constantly checking up on you. They just know.
Now let's talk about the money. How does this build actual, measurable financial value? We're going to look at this from an investor's point of view and see how this architecture literally turns risk into quantifiable, bankable value. So get this, a JP Morgan report on family offices just uncovered something fascinating they call the governance paradox. While 65% of them see AI as their #1 investment theme, a whopping 70% have basically zero exposure to the infrastructure or the governance frameworks you need to actually support and manage it.
And here's the vulnerability that paradox creates. A massive 86% of these offices don't have a documented succession plan. Think about that. When all the knowledge isn't written down, isn't institutionalized, the organization's entire survival rests on just a few key people. That is a huge, unmanaged risk just waiting to blow up.
So, what's the payoff? Well, here it is, plain and simple. Take a look at this chart. A business that's seen as high risk might trade at a valuation of, say, 4 to 6 times its earnings. But that same exact business, once it becomes audit-ready with rock-solid governance, can see its valuation re-rate all the way up to 7 to 9 times its earnings. That is a massive jump in value, and it comes from nothing more than building institutional capital.
This quote sums up the entire shift happening in the investment world right now. Investors are no longer just chasing high-risk potential, what you might call optionality. Instead, they are now paying a huge premium for predictable, reliable, well-documented operations. Okay, so that's the theory. That's the why. Now let's get into the how. Let's look at some real-world examples of organizations putting this into practice. First up, we have the Louisville Beauty Academy. They've gone all in on a pretty radical model they call the public library, where they use what some people might call over-compliance as their core strategic advantage. So how do they do it? Well, a few key things. They keep a public library of all their regulatory back and forth. They use biometric systems to get proof of work for student attendance, which just vaporizes any arguments over training hours. And they purposely go above and beyond the state's safety mandates. All these things together create what they call a certainty engine. It protects students and makes the school incredibly resilient to any challenges. But what's really fascinating is their philosophy. They argue that by automating the skeleton of compliance, you don't dehumanize the place, you do the complete opposite.
By letting the tech handle all the rigid, verifiable stuff, you free up your human staff to focus on the things that actually matter: care, connection, and education.
And look, this idea isn't just for small businesses. You see it on a much bigger scale too. Public institutions like the Kentucky Department of Education use very similar principles. They build public trust by using these transparent, multi-indicator frameworks to measure how schools are doing, relying on verifiable data for everything from test scores to school climate.
All right, now let's look ahead, because emerging tech, specifically AI, is about to pour gasoline on this entire paradigm.
The most forward-thinking organizations are already moving towards this compliance by design architecture. Just imagine an AI that reads new legislation and turns it into machine code. Then, it uses mathematical proofs to verify your systems are compliant, and finally, it automatically rolls out the new rules. This makes your documentation a living, dynamic, self-enforcing asset.
But, and this is a huge but, the order of operations is absolutely critical. If you take an automation-first approach where you just slap AI onto your existing mess, you end up with something called cognitive debt. You get way too reliant on the tools and you lose your institutional memory. The only way to build truly resilient systems is to take a governance-first approach, building AI on top of a strong, documented foundation.
So let's bring it all together. When you really think about it, a documentation-first culture is a survival strategy. It's what preserves your institutional memory. It compresses risk, which increases your valuation. It ensures public accountability, and it builds regulatory resilience. These are the things that actually determine whether you succeed in the long run.
Because here's the thing. Institutions almost never fail in some big dramatic explosion. They fail slowly. They drift as tiny, unverified slips in the basics start to add up over time. Strong documentation, that's the anchor that stops the drift. So the final question you have to ask yourself is this. Are your documents just a dusty record of what you've done in the past? Or are you building them into the powerful, value-creating engine that's going to drive your future?